Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you. I'm just excited to have all of these minds in one space. I know we're a smaller group today, but hopefully we'll have a few more come in as we move forward throughout the night. I'm really excited for tonight's panel discussion. It'll be really what it is, a discussion between all of us, a learning community, and kind of just picking each other's brains about topics that right now are really present and are really pressing. And so I'm excited to have each of you join us. I'm thinking because we are such a small group, why don't we go ahead and go around and introduce ourselves really quickly. I'm more than happy to the panelists if you want me to read your bios. Otherwise, I think we're pretty informal at this point that we can go ahead and introduce ourselves, but happy to do either one. So I will go ahead and let's just do it popcorn style. I can start and then I will popcorn it. I'm Kaylee Bradford. I am the co-chair for the Training is Action series. I've been working on developing this and putting it on for Human Rights Educators USA the past 3 years. As my consulting role, I just stepped into a role. I'm now working for the International Rescue Committee. And so I am there and enjoying that space. But I have been in human rights and human rights education through my graduate studies and on since then, and I've really loved connecting with each of the people here in various facets, and I'm excited to hear each of their thoughts today. But I'll go ahead and popcorn it to John since I can see you.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all this evening. My name is John Terry. I am the New Jersey Regional Representative for HRE USA, and starting this year, I'm also a steering committee member. And I'm humbled and honored to be a member of that amazing crew of people. During the day, I am a K-12 social studies supervisor and K-5 gifted and talented education supervisor for a public school district in New Jersey. And I also work part-time in the fall as an adjunct professor at East Stroudsburg University teaching a social studies methods course. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation this evening for a variety of reasons that I'm sure we're going to get into. So thanks, Kaylee, for bringing us together. I am going to popcorn it over to Sabrina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Sanchez, and she, her pronouns. I am also part of the HRE USA Steering Committee, I think maybe as of last year or a year and a half ago. It's hard to remember. I'm active in the podcast team, and I attend some other meetings like the Strategic Partnerships meeting. And my paid job is with the University of California, San Francisco. I'm a public health specialist. But I'm a part of some other groups, human rights and human rights education groups, in addition to HRE USA, and that really does allow me to utilize my human rights degree and be able to incorporate it within this public health role that I'm currently in. So I will popcorn it over to Kara. Kara.
Hi, so I'm Kara. I am a junior at Albion College, double majoring in political science and English. I'm aspiring to be a human rights lawyer. I work as the student director at our human rights lab at Albion College. Last summer, I had the opportunity to be a Kirby Edmonds Summer Fellow with HRE USA and helped work on this year's Training is Action series. So I'm just really excited to be here and honored. I will popcorn it to Jake.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Skripik. I am a social studies teacher in Manchester, Connecticut. I also serve as a steering committee member for HRE USA. I'm also the Connecticut regional rep for HRE USA. And I serve in a variety of other human rights ed roles. I'm the co-chair for the National Council for the Social Studies, Human Rights Ed community. And I'm really excited to be here with all of y'all to have this fantastic conversation. So it's great to be here. And I'll pass it on to Rick.
Thanks. And I'll echo everybody's thanks to you, Kaylee, for putting all of us together tonight. I'm Rick Halpern. I'm here in Dallas, Texas. I am a history professor here at SMU, but I'm also the director of the SMU undergrad human rights program, which has been at the university since 2006. It's one of only 9 universities in the country that has an undergraduate degree program in human rights. Our students are terrific. I've been a longtime member, over 50 years, with Amnesty International USA, and worked with them on their national board. I'm currently on their board again. But human rights education has been my passion almost since the early 80s. And so this is pretty much all I do in or out of the classroom. I've been with HRE USA for a while, long while, including their Southern Regional Rep, which is no mean trick here in the Deep South, as you all know. But I'm honored to be with everybody, and I'll pass it over to Francoise.
Hi everyone, I'm connecting from Bermuda. I'm a French expat in Bermuda, and I'm a former chair of Amnesty International Bermuda, and implemented the Human Rights Friendly School program for the past 10 years in a local school. I'm very happy to be with you all, and hoping to learn from what's happening in the US. And I don't know who's left. I'm going to pass it on to Lori.
Hi, all. I'm a social studies teacher here in Northeast Connecticut, and I teach ECE classes. And I apologize. I'm so sorry for not having my camera on. I've had a little bit of surgery, so I look and feel a little, and it's on my face. So I look and feel a little rough today, but I really didn't want to miss this. I've been looking forward to it. I really value human rights education and civic education. And every year I think it's more and more important. So every time I get a chance to come to an event like this, or a webinar, or any of it, a workshop, I'm thrilled to meet like-minded people and learn and share. So I'm looking forward to it. Anyone left out there?
Michaela.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am currently a student at USF in their IME department, so International Multicultural Education, HRE, so Human Rights Ed, getting my master's, thinking of going into the doctoral program right after I graduate this coming up spring. So it's coming up soon, but I feel like I live, breathe, and eat this stuff. It's such a passion of mine. So when I had seen that there was signups for it, I jumped right on it, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And we're so happy you're here. As our formal panelists, I thought I should point them out, but I really feel like each of us in this room could be panelists on this topic. We have Jake, Rick, Sabrina, John, and Kara, who have prepared some thoughts and remarks for some questions that I posed to them earlier. However, since we are such a small group, I really do want to keep it as a discussion and as a dialogue. And so feel free to ask questions, to put, if you're not comfortable reaching out and asking them verbally, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'm more than happy to read them out for you. But really, let's just engage in a rich dialogue around these conversations. I will be moderating the discussion, and I'm happy to see where this goes. So we'll go ahead and get started with our first question to open out the night. And feel free, Jake, Rick, John, Kara, Sabrina, whichever you wants to go ahead and start us out, feel free to jump in. But our first question that I had for our panelists is, when you hear this year's theme for the Training as Action series, protecting democracy and promoting human rights, what does that mean to you?
I'll weigh in. It's interesting. I working with kids every day. It is always on the back of my mind of how are we creating a free, safe, equitable space, learning environment, and community for our kids. And sometimes I think the terms democracy and human rights can kind of be used in these kind of vague and open and kind of general ways. I really think about them in terms of how are we making sure that our young people and their parents, their family members feel like they can live in a safe, inclusive environment in their daily life. And that can come with a range of challenges. We know those exist, and I'm sure we will talk about those as we go through the conversation. But I really think about it, not always about, Congress and what's being, decisions that are being made on the national level, but I think about them as what's happening with our kids, what's happening with our parents in communities, and how do we make sure that they live a safe, free, and inclusive life. So that's kind of where my brain is when I think about the theme.
I'll piggyback on that because one of my notes was just access. Like that was one of the first words that when I saw that theme, I was like, all right, what are some tangible opportunities to engage in human rights? What is human rights in practice? Because I think I'm in academia at UCSF, and I just think academia is also like super siloed, and it's just all sometimes could be very theory heavy, and that's not accessible. And so when I think about, how are we safeguarding civic, social, political, economic rights, is making them more approachable, adjusting the language, and just being very clear with how it is that we're communicating and unpacking what democracy means, unpacking what human rights means, because they are labels at the end of the day. And I think that being able to contextualize what that means in different settings can live up to the name of the theme. So I thought about that as well.
My students, I see these, I teach these courses virtually every semester. And whether they are first year students, 18 years young, or graduating seniors still young, but 22 maybe, with at least some university experience in their past, I never cease to be amazed at how many of them really have never, it's amazing how many of them have never had human rights education. It's, I would say it's easily the single greatest failure pedagogically of what is happening in this country and probably around the world, to see a generation of young people get no exposure to this pedagogy. They should have had a lot of this long before, in my opinion, they get into a university. And it's amazing how many of them have never heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So much of this is Human Rights 101. Clearly, people can't demand their rights if they don't even know what their rights are. So, none of this can be taken for granted, that they have some exposure to, knowledge of what it is this pedagogy is all about. So I hear, I'll say this and I'll stop, the common phrase that I never cease to be amazed at, that I still hear, I even hear it in my grad students, is, why am I just now hearing about this? Why am I just now learning about whatever it is, eugenics or some other human rights issue? So it's really trying to help students reorient the way in which they are going to intersect with people in their lives and to intersect with this world. And it's just essential.
I'll jump in here too, and I appreciate Rick providing some color and context for the degree to which folks in the United States and the students that we have in our classrooms and in our schools and our communities are familiar with human rights. And I couldn't help but think about the phrase protecting democracy, promoting human rights. You know, if we're talking about protecting democracy, it implies that we are at a crossroads right now, and democracy is on the defense, right? And I'm thinking about the last couple of years that I was in the classroom and working with my students, teaching a human rights elective course, a current issues elective course. I had my students look at the VDEM index, for example. I don't know if you folks are familiar with that at all, but basically what they do is they do meta studies of the state of democracy, the health of democracy in countries around the world. And if you look at their statistical analyses, they basically show that democracy is on the retreat, you know, both in the US and abroad. And so we have this, you know, this opportunity here, as Rick put it before, right, to not take this for granted, not take democracy for granted, but rather think really, really clearly about what are we doing when it comes to promoting awareness of human rights, and how can that promotion of awareness of human rights help deepen our appreciation for a vibrant, pluralistic democracy that I think all people deserve. So, you know, it's interesting, the choice of language, and it gave me a lot to think about this week.
Yeah, and going off of that, when I hear protecting democracy, promoting human rights, I think just how interconnected the two themes are, and how in order to protect democracy, you really need to be promoting human rights. That for someone to really engage in their government, they need those rights to vote, to participate, have freedom of speech and assembly, all those things necessary for democracy to function. But then other rights, such as economic, social, and cultural rights, because if someone is starving, they're struggling, they're working long hours, there's a hierarchy of needs, and they might not necessarily have the time to go vote or be involved in politics. It's not the front thing on their mind. So for democracy to be fully realized, human rights must be fully realized. And then it goes the other way also, that democracy really helps protect human rights too, because the government can be held accountable to the citizens voting to protect rights. So I think they're just so interconnected and so important. And we see that even more right now with democracy on the defense, like John was saying, trying to make sure that rights are still realized.
I really like that, Cara. And what I'm seeing here is kind of this concept of access and education, but also contextualization within our various fields, and really trying to define the language between that connection with democracy and human rights, which to a lot of us is so clear and makes perfect sense. But I think sometimes when we enter into the conversation with others who aren't necessarily working in the human rights realm, democracy and human rights sometimes can be opposed to one another. So can you all speak a little bit to that, of maybe challenges you've seen in your various contexts, or where those who are claiming to promote democracy are actually up against human rights, or vice versa? Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
For me, I think rights are selective, especially here in the United States, when you look at just different populations and different groups here. What applies to some doesn't apply to all. And that's like the read between the lines of when we look at white privilege and white patriarchy. But for me, I don't, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. A lot of my passions lie within like the undocumented community. I have close people that I know, or family members that are part of that population. And so I always find it really important to educate each other on the human rights, but also how selective it can be. Like, even though, for example, you have the right to asylum here, everyone's supposed to have that right. However, it's not granted to everybody, / there's a lot of reading between the lines when it comes to like racism and colorism and things like that. But I think for me, when it comes to, yes, I work in education, I work with students, but a lot of my passions lie within asylum seekers, refugees, undocumented, especially farm workers. And so, especially with the democracy that we have right now, I will say it's a bit scary. I think it's scary for everybody, but I think it's even scarier when you come here to this country thinking that things are supposed to go one way because that's how it's laid out in our law, in our constitution, and in other forms of declarations. However, it's not always abided by and it's not always followed. And it's a really hard pill to swallow, but it's also hard to kind of explain to someone that's trying to learn about maybe their human rights or just like their basic rights in general, which are part of human rights that aren't followed. And that's a lot about what we talk about like in class when it comes to the UDHR. But I think I'm interested to hear if anyone, or I guess has similar passions when it comes to working in the community, because I know we all like to work in like education and with students, but also I think the community is really important, especially when it comes to protecting democracy, because like Rick had mentioned, not everyone, like I said, I'm 25 and I barely learned about the UDHR when I got to grad school. So like the average person on a day-to-day isn't familiar with it, which is really important. But unfortunately, our education system here in the US, K through 12, doesn't teach us that. So
Well, yeah, I'll follow up with that, and as I say, higher academia doesn't really follow it either. There's over 5,000 colleges and universities in this country, and the fact that only 9 of them have undergraduate human rights programs is pathetic. I mean, you ought to be able to go to any university anywhere in this country, from Key West to Honolulu, and study this the way you would study anything else. But we don't have that. I'll preface my comment by saying this. Since I left undergraduate school in DC in 1971, the only places I've been have been Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and now here. I'm only saying that not to evoke pity or sympathy, but for context. Now here in Texas, we are dominated by a mentality which is just openly hostile to human rights. And the only reason, and I mean the only reason, that I am fortunate enough to be able to still be teaching human rights at SMU is because SMU is a private university. Every public university, and I'm talking starting with the University of Texas, one of the largest universities in this country. And it may conjure up many images to many people, but there are 60,000 students or so down there at UT. The students in Austin has an image that it purports to be progressive and ahead of the rest of Texas. But if this human rights program were at UT, it would have been shut down this past term. Because of the politics that doesn't allow for this, quote, woke culture of teaching the most basic and inherent ideas of respect, tolerance, diversity, and most of all, common to human rights, human dignity. That's what this struggle is all about. Whether we look at people different from ourselves and see them as inherently equal because they're a human being entitled to dignity, or whether we make excuses and ignore them, abuse them, disappear them, arrest them, torture them, or kill them, or whatever. And that's the mentality of this state. So the idea of democracy and human rights, when democracy itself is under retreat, I'm not surprised to see human rights under assault. And clearly those of my students and anybody who's on this panel who is a woman knows this better than those of us who are not. I'll leave it at that. But democracy and human rights, they don't traditionally at the moment in this country go hand in hand. It's disgraceful.
Haley, if you don't mind me jumping in, I really appreciate Michaela and Rick's comments, and I think about this idea of protecting the vulnerable, and I talk a lot about this in like my human rights class and my genocide studies class. And I work in a district that is very fortunate and very rare to have a graduation required human rights class, and I know that is a rarity across the country. But even I think about even the ongoing issue with local boards of education, right? Where you have folks who think that they know what is absolutely best for kids to learn in schools. And they think that there is, to Rick's point, this whole approach to indoctrinate kids or turn them gay or change their identity or whatever it might be, right? And it's really disheartening. It's really disheartening to see news reports of this. It's really disheartening to see this constant barrage of censorship. But I also see that even amongst that conflict, there are glimmers of hope. And I think about, I don't know, maybe 6-8 months ago, and you guys might have seen this, the woman who spoke up at a local board of education and said, what are you talking about? I as a teacher, I don't have time to try and turn your kid gay. Like, what are you talking about? So there are those moments, and I do really deeply believe in that people power, that amongst the nonsense out there and amongst that conflict that we're talking about, people do see that there is light here, and people will step up to call attention to it. It just takes motivation and encouragement and fostering of that culture of, yes, we do need to stand up to those attacks, because we need to protect our kids. We need to protect the vulnerable. We need to protect marginalized groups out there. So I think about that again, back to like the local, how we need to do more to foster that pushback towards those attacks.
I'm thinking of circling back to Kaylee's original question here a little bit, right? And thinking about these, conflicts between, groups claiming to promote democracy, but, denying human rights or vice versa. And, what immediately comes to mind for me is, in the American political tradition and in our, American political discourse, what we typically frame as rights, and this relates to another question that I think Kaylee was thinking about prior to our session about civil rights and how civil rights is, a distinct category of human rights. I think we tend to get stuck in this discourse that gravitates towards a very individualistic notion of rights. And we have the rights as individuals to do certain things, even if they may potentially bring harm to others, right? And I think that that's part of the fallacy of, the rights tradition in the United States, and why human rights education and the elevation of a broader understanding of rights is really, really, really important for the work that we do as human rights educators. I'll give you a couple quick examples, right? One being, you have folks on social media who are making claims to uninhibited free speech, right? Even if those, that use of free speech might invoke acts of bigotry or violence on particular groups of people, right? So there's a lack of awareness between that connection between the individual right to free speech and what that potentially means for consequences for other people. And a couple other examples that come to mind in the past few years, relate to, the way that we've weathered the COVID-19 pandemic, and folks making claims about, I have a right to not wear a mask in certain situations, or take other public health measures that would actually protect other people in the community, or the way that we're going about climate change and addressing the effects of climate change, right? So I think that we have a whole lot of work to do in helping folks understand that with rights come responsibilities, right? And that your rights, your individual rights, do not exist in a silo or a vacuum, but rather your rights coexist with other people's rights with whom you co-inhabit this polis or this society together. And I think that that's a really big part of the work that we can do with human rights education that hopefully can dispel some of those issues, right? Where you have people claiming, I have a right to do this, but not realizing that that claim can be damaging to other people and their dignity.
I'll just quickly add, just since it hasn't been mentioned, but I think that it's a common thread from within all of the remarks that have been shared. But there's very much this growing sense of fear. And I think when people hear about human rights, or hear about democracy, there's this threat, some type of like internal, like visceral threat. either because they're unknown, maybe they are unfamiliar with what it entails, but also like the power dynamics are at play. And so, you know, when you defend something, it's because you feel as though some part of you or your existence in the world is threatened, like something is threatened. And again, like when there is less unknown and less exposure to really understand where that trigger is coming from, people just are afraid. And then that leads to violence, and then it just culminates and it becomes this like culture of violence, which we're seeing, I think, growing exponentially within the US. And violence in the longer, in a broader sense, not necessarily physical violence, but.
So I think, thank you for all of those comments. I think that's very insightful. And I think everything is truly a lived experience by each of us right now. I think I want to go over to what John was saying about the concept of civil rights. So before we get started into this conversation, can you each kind of touch on this concept of civil rights versus human rights? What is this connection? What's the difference and or similarities, and how do we navigate that in our work as advocates in the community?
I can kick this one off this time and then popcorn it to other folks, or other folks can chime in as they see fit. I really enjoy teaching a human rights education course as a social studies, high school social studies teacher myself, and helping students understand that civil rights are a category of human rights, right? Human rights is a larger umbrella under which you have a whole bunch of different categories of rights, which we generally categorize as political rights, economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. Civil rights, I tend to describe to students as quote unquote freedoms from, right? So freedom from arbitrary use of force by a government, for example, freedom from discrimination, freedom from unjust persecution, right? So, basically protecting the individual from harms being done unto them, right? And that's, generally a cherished part of our American political tradition. But some of these other rights are rights that are a little bit foggier and less tangible to most Americans. Those political rights are a freedom to participate in government, a freedom to vote. And those are sort of protected by our foundational documents in the United States, but they're not explicitly stated as the freedom to. And that's especially true for the economic, social, and cultural rights, right? So for example, the right to healthcare, the right to safe drinking water, the right to healthy food, right? Those are economic, and social rights, and the right to a safe workplace, the right to organize a union and advocate for better working conditions. And then also cultural rights are, the rights to preserve one's culture and participate and celebrate one's culture. And that's particularly true for indigenous communities and colonized communities. So that's how I think about civil rights compared to the term human rights. And I'll step out here.
Does anyone else want to add on that or comment on it? I do feel like John gave a really good answer to it. But if not, I will provide the space. We're good. Okay. To go along with well, John, you just summed it up so perfectly well. I think as you can tell, he teaches this. But I think to go along with that, can you speak a little bit to the language of civil rights and human rights? How have you used that in your given context to maybe communicate with people who don't necessarily understand human rights or that connection, or vice versa? Talk a little bit about the language, civil and human, and how can we use that to further our advocacy, or where has it hindered your advocacy as well?
Well, I'll make a few comments, I guess. Certainly, John, I think hit the nail on the head, so I'm not surprised that there was silence after him. So kudos to you, John. And I'm looking at this only from the lens of as a historian. So whenever I'm talking about human rights, I am inextricably linking it to the UDHR. I want students, anybody, because I don't just talk to students about it, but I want people to be aware of the UDHR. Nothing happens in a vacuum, so we're always looking at the historical antecedent as to not just World War II and the Holocaust from which the UN and the UDHR emanated, but I try to talk about this using language of what existed prior to the beginnings of the UN and the UDHR. It was a different America. It was a different world. We live in arguably among the most radical times in world history to be alive. That is to say that more and more people are being born into a world and coming to understand that they do have inherent fundamental rights, and that these rights are linked to some keywords of dignity and equality, this E word. But the world that existed prior to the onset of the UN and the UDHR was just the opposite, including this country, which clearly had nothing to do, the history of equality had nothing to do with the history of this country. The majority of this country's history has been the struggle to attain equality. It's never been granted by governments. One could argue that the struggle of the United States has been the struggle of most groups in it to get to the trough of political social justice power. Women's struggles, Native American, African American, Asian, Hispanic, poor, LGBT, take your pick. This phrase, equal justice under the law, chiseled in stone over the U.S. Supreme Court. It sounds great, but it's a myth. That's not the history of this country. So I try to talk about this in historical terms about linking the UDHR to the ongoing struggle for human rights and civil rights. Again, maybe just to echo a piece of what John just said, as seen as legal rights that people are wanting from discrimination by these horrific laws. So in my class, we're always talking about the ideological nature of law. I'll say this and I'll stop. I try to get people to think, how is the law used? Who's making these laws? For whose betterment are these laws being made? Is the law an umbrella, a shield that protects all groups and all people equally under the law? Or is the law used as a sword to remove certain groups of people from the protection of the law to make them vulnerable to attack in the name of the law? I don't think that you can really talk about civil rights or human rights without grasping the law and who's made it and for whose betterment or detriment it's made, because it's all inextricably linked.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to talk a little bit about the advocacy piece, since I'm not in a classroom or a traditional setting. I typically do a lot of advocacy for human rights defenders and human rights educators digitally, and I work with a team of people across the globe. And one of the major drawbacks that we have increasingly seen is these very coercive and subjective digital parameters when it comes to promoting it online. And not necessarily only promoting within social media platforms, but just doing a Google search or posting on our WordPress account. And most of the time, the languages that we're using are too radical. And so we'll get like a rejection from Facebook, or they'll delete our post on Twitter or X, or they'll they're just gatekeeping really when it comes to advocating and getting our message across. Another thing that we noticed was, this hasn't happened as much in the US, but you know, there's a lot of internet shutdowns in Africa, and most of the time the human rights defenders and the human rights educators or any paraprofessional liaison just doesn't have access to the information. And more so when I think about here in the US, we might not have internet shutdowns, but a lot of people don't have access to Wi-Fi or to a digital device that can, again, like access these features. So one of our workarounds is WhatsApp, and being able to communicate messages, again, that are accessible and like short stories on your WhatsApp status. And so I think in a larger scale, it's just, you know, like, what is the baseline? What is just like digital infrastructure here in the US? I have hope that, you know, we're beginning to address some of this very dangerous surveillance tactics, and beginning to at least formulate some legal mechanisms when it comes to protecting just digital advocacy and digital education. So
I want to piggyback on that, Sabrina, because I think it's important to also have that collaboration and community organization piece in this conversation. So in what ways have all of you in your various advocacy found ways to collaborate or to partner with civil organizations who are protecting civil rights, and that's kind of their passion and their movement, but adding into that partnership and that collaboration piece to further the ultimate movement of human rights?
Hi, sorry, my internet's been having problems, so I've been in and out here a bit. But I guess I can speak for one specific example relating to voting rights. So for the Human Rights Lab, for example, last year we did a lot around voting rights on campus. We worked with the League of Women Voters and helped create information for people to know how to vote, how to register to vote, information on candidates. But then we also connected it to Article 21 of the UDHR and how the right to vote is a human right. But then we did work with like the different organizations, civil rights organizations, on the right to vote. So that's one example from Albion.
You know, all of my students, all of our students in the human rights program, and there's almost 300 of them, they all have to do 20 hours of community service with a local civil or human rights agency that is working to make Dallas better. Whatever, and it runs the full spectrum of the articles within the UDHR. Now, granted, Dallas is a large city and it's got no shortage of human rights problems and no shortage of people mercifully working to make it better. But they're involved in everything from literacy issues, poverty issues. We have bilingual or multilingual students acting as interpreters in asylum hearings. They are working at a local center for survivors of torture, at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, the only such museum of its kind in the country. So they are in the community, and they don't just do the hours, they also have to write a serious paper about their experience and come to grips with it as a reflection as to the impact that they feel they had, and more importantly, the impact of a community that normally they wouldn't necessarily be linked to, homelessness, which is a crime here in Dallas. So they have to do these hours and think and reflect and seriously write about it every semester.
I would just jump in to the question of how do we continue to kind of foster this partnership work, and I think a lot of times the I wouldn't say the downside, but the issue with human rights work becomes that we work in our own silos. We work as, okay, we're this organization with these particular set of goals and priorities, which is fantastic. And there's really deep impacts that are happening. But a lot of times we're not talking to each other, or we talk to each other, but just for this one type of thing, this one-off type of event or opportunity. And I think I would just say I would love to see more talking, collaboration, dialogue happening between groups that have really, really a great stake in the national and international human rights movement, but are maybe just kind of focused on their own priorities. I think we need to kind of be humble in that regard and say, hey, how can an Amnesty and an RFK Human Rights find partnership with one another? Even if at the end of the day, they're going in different directions, how do we bridge that connection? I think the human rights movement altogether would just be, which would be stronger if we have more bridges. So I'll just throw it out there as a possibility.
I agree with you, Jake. And maybe I throw out another question to the group of, in what ways have you seen a collaboration happen between groups that you feel was very effective, or ideas for how we potentially could foster these conversations moving forward?
Well, I guess I'll jump in just to start. And again, I'm just using the experience here that we're going through at the moment. Here in Dallas, we are in the process of, we've created an entity, Human Rights Dallas, which is the umbrella organization for lots of different human rights groups doing this work, just to get to what Jake so correctly highlighted, was to get everybody out of their silos and for them, us, to work together so that any human rights agency, it's not an us, it's us, it's all of us. So we are doing that, and we are now in the process. Of course, the UDHR is going to turn 75 on December 10th. It's a huge anniversary. Clearly, that is not going to or shouldn't be missed across this country, and it'll be a big deal here. We're trying to get the Dallas City Council to adopt the UN resolution and have Dallas declare itself as a human rights city. There's not many of them in the United States, but it's a big deal to get the city committed to the advocacy, defense, and protection of all people's rights in this city, whether they're passing through the airport or whether they live and work here. And this is what our coalition of groups has been working on. And we hope to have this in time for the 75th. But even if not, if the Dallas City Council is not yet prepared to do this, that struggle will go on until it is accomplished. So it's been a real learning process and a struggle, a frustration, to say the least, to get people to come out of their silos, but to see the bigger and more common good that we now envision and see as Human Rights Dallas, for sure. But I'd lie if I said it's been easy, because it hadn't.
Something that keeps, thanks, Rick, something that keeps coming up again with when we're trying to promote and advocate is really including these call to actions. Again, like a simple call to action that's clear so that people understand and are feel guided and motivated to join X movement or to receive X resource. And I think that we just need to be more creative. I think that we are seeing new, resourceful, and creative ways when it comes to organizing, promoting, collaborating, but I think there's still a lot more growth there. We have to be creative when we're pitching so that you can get that buy-in and just really like, what's the benefit if I were to join this, or if I were to attend this course? And again, I think we can get real preachy really fast and then forget to include a call to action. And so again, like, how are they going to add value to this project, program, movement, goal, etc.? So I think those are some ideas that I think have been helpful for me and like the groups that I'm a part of. And then I've been thinking about like some collaborations that come to mind. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, like that was very prominent here in the US. The Me Too movement was really prominent. And I think that really kind of ignited this passion for people who were unfamiliar about human rights in general. And I think that has really it helps to root and continue to bridge these collaborations. I could think of much smaller grassroots ones, but I think those are the two main ones that like had this trickle down effect across the US.
I sometimes think it can be as simple as just those of us that do have access or that do have the knowledge to just share it with others that either don't have access or really don't have any idea. Like for example, I talk to my mom a lot after class about what I'm learning, and what's just going on in the world. And she always calls me a nerd for being super into geography, but I tell her in the community that I'm in and that I surround myself with at school, we get people all over from different countries. So when I'm speaking to someone about their homeland, I would like to know where that's at. But for example, we did just have a guest speaker come to our class, and she is a Cambodian genocide survivor. She had mentioned that she doesn't like to talk about it, even though she does do these speeches and she does go around and talk to people. She says that she doesn't like talking about it because it digs up a lot of trauma for her, obviously, but she says that she hopes that her tears and her pain and her trauma is worth it, so that us as students and professors, colleagues can actually go out into the world and spread her story or the information, so things like this don't happen again. I spoke to my mom about the Uyghur genocide that's happening in China. She didn't know what was going on or what's happening, especially my mom's low-key a doomsday prepper, so she's been talking a lot about World War III and what's been happening and stuff. And I just thought I would like mention it to her because that's kind of a big part of what's going on. But unfortunately, like you were talking about, Sabrina, with some governments, especially with social media, it's kind of been shut down. So I think if we want to just start as simple as spreading knowledge is power. And I think that we can always start there. Sometimes I get hard on myself for being so young and not having all of this experience. But I mean, a lot of the doctoral students in my program are in their 40s. So I'm like, well, you do have 20 more years plus experience than me. So I can't be that hard on myself. But what can I do as one person to kind of push things or further a mission? And that's just by spreading knowledge. So I think that if we do that, then we can really reach far and wide. We just have to continue doing it in order for that to work.
I'll just weigh in on one other thing. I'll just say one quick thing. I think, this also relies on bringing people to the table and saying to folks, hey, I think you would serve well, or I think we should partner, and I'm going to metaphorically or literally take you and bring you to the table and say, how can we build this partnership? And sometimes it takes those little moves, whether it's with an organization or with just an individual, to build that partnership. And I think we shouldn't undervalue those folks and those organizations out there doing that good work, right? Like I work and I partner with, or I'm part of the Connecticut Human Rights Partnership, which tries to be an incubator for that, of like, how do we bring these organizations together and say, we want you at the table? So that takes hard work, that takes effort, that takes time, that takes your resources that you may or may not have. But I think that's really, really critical to say, we value your work and you should be at the table.
Can I add a quick footnote? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say something similar to Jake, that you have to be very intentional to build these partnerships and bring people to the table, like Jake was saying, and he said it does take the time. And then going off of that, not only taking the time, but sometimes knowing what language to use is important, because the human rights language isn't necessarily best for all circumstances. And sometimes using the civil rights language or something along the lines of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging can actually bring more people to the table. And then from there, you can explain more the human rights language and maybe counter some of the stereotypes that might be associated with that. But being able to use those different languages and different frameworks to really have the same goals, but just communicated about it with perhaps a slightly different way.
Now, I just wanted to throw in a quick footnote, and all of this, civil rights, human rights, we're all dealing with, for want of a better phrase, bad human behavior. And invariably, we're all in communities, large or small, who have committed bad and horrific human behavior in the past and possibly still even in the present. Excuse me. So that an integral part of this work, I would say one of the foundational pieces of this work, must be to work for a recognition of that past or present bad behavior, and to work to secure human apologies in the name of that past or present bad behavior, a recognition that these things were done or are being done. So I know here it's been a key point for us to engage. We only have one major newspaper here in this city, but to engage the paper and the Dallas city government to come to grips with these terrible things that were done in public here in Dallas. I mean, there's a notorious photograph of a public lynching in downtown Dallas in 1910 in front of 8,000 people in broad daylight. And only 2 years ago did a public marker go up at that spot right in the middle of downtown Dallas after a great deal of educating the city and the media that finally realized, you got to recognize human wrongs. And these things to commemorate things that were done in our communities, maybe not on our watch, but that there are groups, communities in our cities who feel the pain of that past behavior because it frequently has never been acknowledged or apologized for. So recognizing these wrongs and working to at least secure an apology. I'm not even talking about reparations, but just to secure an apology would be a major, major first step in trying to move a lot of communities together in a healthy way simultaneously under a common recognition.
Thanks, Rick. And thanks all of you for the comments on that. I think there's some really great insight in all of that there's little tangible pieces with each of your comments that we can take forward in our own context. I want to kind of shift our conversation for this last little bit from the community activism space to really the classroom. We have a lot of educators here, and I feel like this could be a fruitful conversation. So what is the relationship between civic education and human rights education? And how can we use civic education as a platform for furthering human rights learning?
I'm struggling right now to remember Rosemary Blanchard's exact quote. Rosemary Blanchard is a longtime advocate and member of our human rights education community, but she's very, very articulate when she puts it in her words. But basically, I'm thinking about, civic education as this contested ground in the history of education in the United States. And on one hand, right, you have a civic education that is about promoting a type of loyalty and obedience to the state, right, or to governments. And on the other hand, you have a civic education that is grounded in philosophy, that is really about promoting human dignity, right? And it is from that which governments have, been created to serve human purposes, right? And not the other way around. So it's really, really, really important, right, when we're thinking about moving in, the direction of, bringing resources to support civic education or bringing civic education to life in our classrooms. It's important to really put the human dignity focus first. And, thinking about how are we framing a curriculum, for example, right? How are we going about this work with the students in the classroom? And ultimately, it's not about, loyalty or obedience to one's government or a particular place, but rather about, loyalty. I would rather rephrase it, loyalty to, a common cause of human dignity and human rights. So I think it's important to put those principles first and not the other way around.
I'll speak to one brief thing that I think can happen in the classroom. We talk about these very basic rights and freedoms, right? And you could talk about freedom of speech, you could talk about right to a fair trial, you could talk about right to protest, right? And those are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But for kids, you could make that connection very, very clearly within a civics class, right? You could have that conversation about, hey, we're talking about right to a fair trial in the United States through a civics lens, but hey, this is human rights language, right? And that you building that connectivity between the two lands of human rights and civics, I think is really, really important for our kids to understand that they're not separate. There's this connective tissue between those two lands, and we need to protect them both on an international scale, but there's good work that can happen in our own small communities to protect those very, very basic rights and freedoms. So I think we were talking about this previously, but I think language, intentional language, and for kids, especially student-friendly language, is really critical for making that connection.
I think the ideal situation would be to have a human rights approach to education, because teaching human rights is not just a lesson for the day. I think it's Kofi Annan who was saying that. I think the beauty of the human rights friendly school program, which was developed by Amnesty International, is that it's an holistic program, and it would try to build a culture of human rights in a school by looking at the curriculum, the relationship between people, the governance, and even the environment. So this sounds good in theory, but it's a bit more difficult to implement it in practice, because you have to get the buy-in of the management, and often teachers would say, oh, this is not the priority, or because of the workload, it comes second. But I think the intention of Amnesty when developing this program was quite good.
Something that I thought about, and again, I used to be in the classroom, but not anymore, was, and someone said, I forget who it was, that someone said reframe or shifting the perspective, and kind of on that note is being able to, I think, reorient human rights competencies or not to reorient, but to supplement human rights competencies with capabilities. So that you can think about this like transferable skill sets and transferable knowledge, so that you can apply that after education. And I think that people can hang on to that, and you can see it, and you can see how it begins to bleed into all of the domains of agricultural, education, medicine, research, and you can begin to like really utilize all of those learnings on a more, in a more technical way. That's something that came up.
Yeah, and those capabilities that Sabrina was mentioning there made me, recall the three pillars of human rights education, right? Which are, teaching about human rights, teaching for human rights, and teaching through human rights. And civic education is just a fertile ground for all that kind of work, right? So not only just teaching the content of human rights through the framework of a civics course, but also imbuing students with a sense of agency, right? That they can, actively participate in their communities, right? And make a difference in their communities, and hopefully, advocate for human rights, right? Using the instruments of democracy within their communities, right? That's the education for human rights and through human rights. And I think that that's a really important part of it. And, I just want to take a moment and highlight, to give a concrete example, some of the work that we've done here in New Jersey. We haven't required students taking civics courses by the time that they graduate a K-12 experience until very recently. We have a new law that was passed in 2021, which required at least one semester of civic education at the middle school level. And what they did was they asked the New Jersey Center of Civic Education, which is based at Rutgers University, to develop a curriculum framework for teachers to use in the classroom. And we had some fruitful discussions about what that framework could look like. And what that center produced was a curriculum framework that starts with the notion of human rights, right? And then moves into, what does the United States government look like? What are its founding ideals? What is the Constitution? But then eventually the students have to return to those notions of human rights and then hold up the mirror to themselves and to their own democracy, right? To what extent are we living up to these ideals, right? And then what do we do about it, right? So the students are learning human rights content, and by learning human rights content in the context of a civics course or in the context of civic education, it necessarily forces students of that process, right, to hold up that mirror and think about, to what extent are we living up to the ideals of our democracy, and to what extent do we have work that we need to do moving forward, right? And it's grounded within the content, right, the classroom discussion, the teaching about human rights, but then also providing students with those opportunities beyond the walls of their classroom to live the democratic experience is a really important piece of civic education that is imbued with human rights education.
John, I'll just
Yeah,
jump. I love that idea of enshrining it into law, and enshrining it into, state standards and what have you, because I think that builds I don't want to call it firewall, but I will say firewall per se, to be able to say, like, this is justified and this is something that we are going to do across districts, no matter what the interests or agendas are out there. I just want to comment on one thing. I think, again, when we think about this connection between human rights and civic education, I think I would argue that the current generation of students that we're seeing in our elementary, middle, and high schools have grown up in a time where social movements, civic action is on the rise, and that they've lived in a world where they've seen it either on social media or in the news or on Snapchat or TikTok, lived out, right? And so this is part of kind of the conversations. And sometimes, especially for kids, like, how can we take both the vagueness of that, and how do we take the very present real attitude that comes up of, I don't know how to take action. I don't know how to take it a step farther than what Mr. Skripik is telling me of, like, hey, human rights are important, but the access to actually taking it a step further, to John's point of the through and for. And I think that is the current frontier and the next frontier of the human rights movement, is how do we make sure that in our schools, in our communities, especially young people, have the opportunities and the access to not just talk about the issues and talk about human rights, but actually taking a step further. And that requires money, that requires a time and effort. That also might require restructuring a little bit of our education system. And if the Department of Ed is listening right now, like, maybe I'm speaking off the cuff, but I think like it does take real deep work and systems changes they're going to need to take place. So I only mention that because I think, again, sometimes we preach out there that human rights are important, that taking civic action is important, but unless we're actually going to put our money with where our mouth is, I think that we're going to keep kind of being in this spiral of just talking, when really we need to build access and build opportunities for taking action. So I'll just throw that out there. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about that.
Yeah, I have some thoughts going off what you were saying, and John and Sabrina, that action component is really key. And it definitely has a spot with civic education, and there's a place there where it can be involved. And we know that that action component's important for human rights work. That learning about the government and the systems in place, knowing the importance of voting, getting people out to vote, knowing how to contact your decision makers, knowing the policy process to lobby those different things, all of these different action steps that can be taken and are very much a part, and should be a part even more so than they are now, of civic education. And then people, after learning those skills, can go out and advocate for their rights and the issues that they're passionate about.
Thank you, Cara, and thanks so much all of you for your comments and this amazing discussion that we've been having. I do want to stop us for a minute and allow space for these last 15 minutes if there are any other questions that any of you have that you would like to pose to the group. Now is the time, is yours. And if not, I do have one last question, but I wanted to provide the space for any of us to pose any questions that we feel are relevant.
Well, it's not a question, but I sure hope that you'll send some of your students down here to consider going to any of the 9. Of course, I'm biased that they should come to Dallas, but to stress that they can. There are now 9 options for them if they indeed want to study in depth and major in human rights, and hopefully go on to do graduate work within human rights. But if you have anybody from your part of the region that wants to get away and come down into the belly of the beast, I'd be willing to talk to anybody and to work with them. So just FYI.
Thanks, Rick. Anyone have any questions before I pose my very last one for the session? Okay. If you do, cut me off. My very last question for all of us today, after we've had all of this discussion, is this: what advice do you have for us practitioners and teachers and students, where all of us are in various contexts, to navigate this work, the controversy, the challenge, the lack of action? Really, what advice do you have for each of us as we're moving forward from this session in ways that we can take our discussion and move forward in our work?
I'll start, because I was gonna say something after Jake was talking, and it really gets to the how. And I think that we need to just continue to build solidarity networks, transnational networks, especially leveraging from grassroots organizations. And like, I will preach that forever and forever. I've worked so much with grassroots populations, and it's really important to have them at the table from the beginning, and they have that local context, they have their local realities, and sometimes they have more freedom to do some of the how piece when it comes to education because of a lot of these limitations and all of the standardizations. And I think grassroots people and groups, grassroots movements are again like really creative and really resourceful because of just the lack of access to resources that they generally have. So I think that's just my advice, is just to continue to think outside the box and to continue to grow your networks and to include grassroots first, and just to move beyond all of the formal approaches that we've been taking, and just to continue to take risks, really. And yeah, if we think of more, I'll come off mute, but that's the most important one that I wanted to share.
I'll jump in. I would somewhat piggyback off of Sabrina, but I think Sabrina said this earlier. There's a lot of fear out there, real present fear in many spaces. And I think I would just recommend to folks, we got to be bold. That's all we can do, right? And despite all the challenges, despite the fear that's out there, even if you feel like this work is not applicable or you can't do it within your space or community, find that boldness and really try to hone in on that and see where are there even small micro steps that you could take to make really, really important change. And I think standing up and being bold is just one thing I would leave the group with.
I'll segue from that, or continue with both of these great comments from these panelists. We all deal with young people, and not surprisingly, most of these young people are, and I use this word in a good way, fanatically passionate about wanting a better society for themselves, their families, their loved ones, and the families they're going to have. They are inspirational in their fervor. So my strong suggestion would be to do our best never to take no from an administrative standpoint that tries to limit that fervor, curtail it in any way. This generational fervor has to be recognized. It has to be embodied, emboldened, and ideally we have to do our best to help it become fulfilled, so that the promise of a better America doesn't have to come 80 more years into these young people's future, but there's great truth in the phrase, now is the time. So just to embrace their fervor and to work with them to help bring about the best society that we are entitled to and that we have to have.
I really appreciate the last couple comments that folks were making, because I think it's a really important reminder to stand firm to our principles, right, and not waver when we're confronted with obstacles. I do find myself often navigating fractured political spaces, polarized political spaces, at work, at home, and communities that I inhabit. And I think, in order to move forward, we don't operate in a silo, and it does require the collective effort of entire communities, or at least a large portion of communities, right? And some folks may be on the fence. Some folks may be really resistant. I think it's really, really important to spend time with people, having meaningful conversations with people, understanding what their assumptions are, what their deeply rooted beliefs are. Speak to those assumptions, speak to those deeply rooted beliefs, and try to unpack those, often as misconceptions, and try to chart a path forward, right? And if they can see you for who you are and your humanity and your intentions, a lot of the time, I think that will at least get you a couple steps forward. Obviously, we also operate in a world where there are malevolent forces, and I don't want to be completely naive about that either. But there are folks out there who might not be completely aware of, where we can go with human rights and how we can chart a path for better democracy. So my advice would be to start by working with those folks who might be on the fence or not sure about what they're capable of doing, and work with them on a path forward. So that's what I would offer.
And I would say, I think Jake mentioned this earlier, and it really goes with what everyone else has been saying, is we have to have hope that change is possible. Have to keep pushing through the hard times and recognize that even though there's all these obstacles, that things can change, and we just have to keep going. And if not for us, then maybe for the next generation, but we have to have that hope and keep holding on to it.
Thank you, Cara, and thank you all of our wonderful panelists. If you can all join each other and thanking them, Rick, John, Cara, Sabrina, and Jake, we're so grateful for you and joining this conversation with us, as well as Michaela and Kayla and Francois. We are so grateful that you're here. And thank you again for this amazing conversation. We will let you go a little bit early. I want to be considerate of your time, but just a little plug for the rest of the series. This was kind of our big kickoff discussion. And our next Thursday, our session will be on facilitating difficult conversation. So really is a concrete workshop from what we've been talking about today of how can we have a skill to facilitate those discussions in our various groups and contexts. So if you haven't gone on and registered for that one, I highly recommend it. We have a great two facilitators, Rebecca and Manpreet. They do this for a living, and they are just absolutely wonderful. And so there's my plug for the next session. But if you can't attend next week, we still have multiple weeks following that will be really great on things like how to talk to those in power and those who are leading our communities, how to develop an advocacy campaign, really these different skills that will allow you to move your human rights advocacy forward. So thank you again so much for joining us tonight. We're so grateful to have you here, and hopefully we can see some of you in the sessions coming up after this.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
All right. Thank you, Kaylee. Appreciate it.
You mind ending the recording?
Yes, I will do that. Let me try that. I will stop recording, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Stop recording.